I changed my bank details and started receiving my salary on a completely new card. When I arrived home after a long day at the engineering firm, my wife and her grown daughter were waiting for me in the foyer, absolutely furious. "Are you crazy?" my stepdaughter screamed at the top of her lungs. "My mother almost had a heart attack at the ATM." I looked at both of them with complete calm. I delivered my response, and within seconds, all the blood drained from their faces, and they practically collapsed onto the floor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. I turned the heavy brass key in the front door of the house I had paid for entirely with my own sweat. I am a 66-year-old man. I have spent the last 40 years of my life working as a structural engineer. I build bridges. I calculate load-bearing weights, and I anticipate where pressure will cause a foundation to crack. For the last 15 years, I applied that same discipline to my marriage. I absorbed the pressure. I carried the financial weight of my wife Diane and her daughter Brittany. I provided the sprawling 5-bedroom house with the manicured lawn. I paid for the luxury cars. I funded a lifestyle that neither of them had ever earned. I walked through the solid oak door and stepped into the grand entryway. The imported Italian marble floor gleamed under the crystal chandelier. The house was usually perfectly quiet at this hour. Today, the air was thick with hostility. Diane stood near the sweeping staircase with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her posture was rigidly arrogant. She wore a designer silk blouse that I had paid for just last week. Her face was flushed with a terrifying, righteous indignation. Standing right beside her was her 30-year-old daughter, Brittany. Brittany was vibrating with a toxic mixture of panic and rage. She held a stack of declined credit card receipts in her shaking hand. The moment the front door clicked shut behind me, the verbal assault began. Brittany did not even give me a second to take off my coat. "Are you completely out of your mind?" she shrieked. Her voice echoed harshly against the high ceilings of the foyer. My mother went to the bank to withdraw her weekly cash allowance, and the machine swallowed her card. She tried to use the joint credit account to buy groceries, and it was declined in front of the entire store. She almost had a heart attack from the humiliation. "What did you do to the bank accounts?" Diane stepped forward, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You need to call the bank manager right this second and fix this embarrassing mistake," Diane commanded. Her tone was not a request. It was an order from someone who truly believed she owned me. "You have completely ruined our afternoon." I did not raise my voice. I did not match their frantic energy. I simply unbuttoned my wool overcoat, slipped it off my shoulders, and hung it neatly on the wooden rack by the door. I placed my leather briefcase on the entryway table. The silence I forced upon the room made them both deeply uncomfortable. I turned to face them. I looked directly into Diane's eyes. "I changed my direct deposit because I found the forged power of attorney documents you used to take a $200,000 loan against my house," I said clearly. The silence that followed was absolute. The arrogant sneer on Diane's face froze entirely. I kept my voice perfectly level, delivering each sentence like a precise strike from a hammer. "I discovered the discrepancy in the property tax records yesterday morning. I went to the bank today at noon. I sat down with the fraud division. I showed them my real signature, and then I showed them the amateur forgery you submitted to secure that loan against the equity of my home. The accounts are not experiencing a glitch. The accounts are completely frozen pending a federal investigation." Brittany opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked at her mother in sheer terror. I continued my explanation, without giving them a moment to breathe. "The bank security cameras captured both of you walking into the branch 3 weeks ago. The manager verified that you presented the forged documents while claiming I was incapacitated in the hospital with a heart condition. That was a fatal miscalculation. The police now have the high-definition security footage of you signing my name. I have officially reported the $200,000 as stolen funds. You have no money. You have no credit. You are both facing felony charges for wire fraud and elder financial abuse. The physiological reaction to catastrophic failure is immediate and undeniable. Diane's legs simply gave out. Her knees buckled under the crushing weight of sudden, inescapable reality. She collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug. Her manicured hands clawed at the fabric as she gasped for air. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and aged. She tried to form words, perhaps another lie or an excuse, but her throat clamped shut. The financial empire she had built on my back had just evaporated into thin air. Brittany realized in that exact second that her mother could not protect her. The arrogance that usually defined Brittany vanished, replaced by the frantic, disorganized terror of a trapped animal. She dropped the useless credit card receipts onto the floor. She pulled her expensive smartphone from her purse with trembling hands and dialed a number. "Todd, pick up the phone," Brittany sobbed into the receiver. Todd was her fiancé. He was an arrogant car salesman who always looked at me like I was a walking wallet waiting to die. "Todd, you have to help us. He knows about the loan. He went to the bank. The accounts are completely frozen, and he said the police have the video." Brittany was hyperventilating, pacing back and forth across the marble floor. I could hear Todd's voice shouting through the phone speaker. His voice was laced with aggression and panic. "What do you mean he knows?" Todd barked through the phone. "Did he bring the documents home? Does he have the bank files with him? Get his briefcase." "Brittany, listen to me right now. Grab his briefcase and find the new account numbers or the withdrawal slips. We need cash tonight." Brittany's eyes darted toward the leather briefcase resting on the entryway table. I saw the desperate calculation in her mind. She lunged for it. She actually tried to tackle me out of the way to reach my property. I simply sidestepped her clumsy attempt. I placed my hand firmly on the handle of the briefcase and pulled it back. With my other hand, I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed 911. I put the call on speaker so they could hear every single word. "Yes, operator." "I need police dispatch to my residence immediately," I said calmly. "I have an active robbery in progress. 2 individuals are attempting to steal financial documents from my home. Yes, they are still inside the house." The sound of the emergency operator confirming the police dispatch broke the final thread of their sanity. Diane scrambled to her feet, her designer shoes slipping awkwardly on the marble floor. She grabbed Brittany by the arm, her nails digging into her daughter's skin. "We have to go," Diane hissed violently. "We have to get out of here right now." They did not try to argue. They did not try to pack. They abandoned the matched set of designer luggage they had left near the stairs for their planned weekend spa retreat. They ran toward the front door, pushing each other out of the way in a humiliating scramble to escape. The heavy door slammed shut behind them. I walked over to the front window and watched them throw themselves into Diane's luxury SUV. The tires screeched against the asphalt as they sped out of the driveway, fleeing the sanctuary they had tried to steal. I canceled the call with the police operator, explaining the intruders had fled the premises. I locked the deadbolt. The house was finally quiet again. The battle had just begun, but I had already destroyed their supply lines. The morning after their frantic escape from my house, Diane and Brittany sought refuge in the only environment where they felt they truly belonged. They drove straight to the Grand Plaza Hotel downtown. It is a 5-star monument to excess and vanity. For years, I had quietly paid the exorbitant bills whenever Diane decided she needed a weekend away from the exhausting burden of living in the luxury home I provided. They checked into a premium suite, fully expecting to charge the expensive room rate and their extravagant room service breakfast to my platinum credit card. They still believed my warnings were just empty threats. They thought I was simply throwing a temporary tantrum that they could comfortably wait out in a silk bathrobe while I cooled off. I know exactly how their morning unfolded, because I was sitting in my quiet kitchen, drinking a dark roast coffee, watching the automated security alerts flash across my phone screen. At 10 o'clock, Diane walked down to the expansive marble lobby to check out. She had spent the last 12 hours convincing herself and her daughter that she was still in complete control. She approached the front desk with her usual aura of entitled superiority. She wore large designer sunglasses indoors to hide her puffy eyes, projecting an image of untouchable wealth to everyone around her. The lobby was crowded with wealthy tourists and local business executives attending a morning conference. It was the perfect stage for the absolute destruction of her pride. Diane slid the heavy metal platinum card across the polished mahogany counter. The young concierge, a perfectly groomed man in a sharp suit, smiled politely and inserted the card into the terminal. He waited for the approval chime. Instead, the machine emitted a sharp, harsh beep. The screen flashed a bright red error message. The concierge frowned slightly, removed the card, and wiped the digital chip on his sleeve. He tried again. The same harsh beep echoed in the quiet space between them. Diane sighed loudly, tapping her manicured fingernails against the counter, clearly annoyed by what she assumed was the incompetence of the hotel staff. "I am sorry, madam, but this card is being declined," the concierge said. His voice was polite but carried clearly across the polished floor. Diane stiffened. She pulled off her sunglasses, her eyes flashing with immediate anger. "That is absolutely impossible," she snapped loudly, drawing the attention of a nearby group of corporate businessmen. "Run it again right now. You are clearly doing it wrong. Do you know how much money my family spends at this establishment every single year?" The concierge maintained his professional composure, but his eyes grew cold. He typed a few keys on his computer and looked back at her without a smile. "I have run it 3 times, madam. The bank has not only declined the charge, but the system is officially instructing me to confiscate the card due to suspected fraudulent activity. I am afraid I have to keep this card. Do you have another form of payment for the $640 balance?" The blood drained from Diane's face. The words fraudulent activity hung in the air like a physical weight. The businessmen standing nearby stopped talking entirely and turned to watch the commotion. Brittany, who had been standing a few feet away, scrolling through her phone, froze in her tracks. She stepped closer to her mother, her face turning a sickly pale color. Diane's hands began to shake aggressively as she dug frantically into her expensive leather purse. She pulled out a gold rewards card and shoved it at the young man. "Use this one," she commanded, her voice losing its arrogant edge and cracking with a rising, undeniable panic. "Just run the card so we can leave." The concierge inserted the gold card. The machine beeped harshly again. "Declined," he stated flatly. He was looking at her not as a valued guest, but as a security risk attempting to steal services. Every single person in the immediate vicinity was watching them. The wealthy matriarch and her spoiled daughter were standing at the front desk of the city's most expensive hotel, entirely unable to pay for the bed they had slept in. My phone vibrated on the kitchen table, displaying the second denied transaction. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my coffee. The illusion they had lived in for 15 years was shattering into a million pieces on a public marble floor, and I did not have to lift a single finger to make it happen. Diane snatched the useless gold card from the concierge and turned away from the staring crowd. She grabbed Brittany by the elbow and practically dragged her out through the revolving glass doors of the hotel lobby. The morning air was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the cold reality settling into Diane's chest. They reached the valet stand to retrieve her imported luxury SUV. As they waited in the driveway, Diane's smartphone chimed loudly. It was an email notification. Then another chime followed immediately. Then a text message alert. Suddenly, her phone began vibrating continuously in her palm like a dying machine. The financial severance I had meticulously programmed the night before was finally executing its automated sequence. For 15 straight years, Diane had never once looked at a bank statement. She never had to. When I married her, I made a solemn promise to her dying father that I would always provide for her and her young daughter. I took that oath incredibly seriously. I worked brutal 80-hour weeks at the engineering firm. I delayed my own retirement time and time again. I even ignored the severe chest pains that landed me in the hospital just last month, all just to keep the silent engine of her extravagant lifestyle running smoothly. She truly thought money simply existed as a natural law of the universe. Now looking at her glowing screen on the sidewalk, she was forced to see the raw machinery of my massive sacrifice shutting down piece by piece. The first email was from the exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club. The automated message coldly informed her that her platinum membership had been immediately suspended due to a returned payment for her monthly dues. That was $2,000 a month I would no longer bleed for her vanity. The second alert was a text from the luxury car dealership. The direct debit for the lease on her heavy imported SUV had bounced. The message warned that a repossession order would be automatically generated if funds were not secured within 24 hours. Brittany's phone began chiming right next to her. The holistic wellness spa where she spent most of her useless afternoons had canceled her standing appointments because her linked payment account was completely frozen. Standing on the concrete curb, pure panic fully consumed them. Diane desperately swiped through the cascading red alerts. She could not comprehend why I would suddenly break my 15-year promise. She had forgotten her own breathtaking arrogance. She had forgotten the text messages I found on her synchronized tablet the day I was discharged from the cardiac ward. While I was hooked up to heart monitors terrified I might not see another morning, Diane had texted Brittany, complaining that my hospital stay was ruining their planned luxury vacation to Aspen. She had actually typed that I was being incredibly dramatic and that she hoped my life insurance policy was fully updated. That exact moment was when my promise to her father died forever. That was when I realized I was not a husband to her, but a host organism being entirely drained by parasites. The valet finally pulled the gleaming black SUV up to the curb and stepped out, holding the leather keys out to Diane. She stared blankly at the expensive vehicle. For the very first time in 15 years, she realized it did not actually belong to her. It belonged to the bank, and without my money, the bank was coming for it quickly. The financial umbilical cord was officially cut. Every single automatic payment that maintained their plastic illusion of superiority was permanently dead. Diane slowly took the keys from the valet. Her hand was shaking so violently she almost dropped them onto the pavement. She finally understood that I had not just closed a bank account. I had systematically and entirely dismantled her world. Diane drove the stolen luxury vehicle directly to the main branch of my bank downtown. She parked illegally in the loading zone right in front of the main entrance, leaving the hazard lights flashing. She truly believed that the rules of ordinary society simply did not apply to her. She stormed through the heavy glass doors of the building with a terrifying momentum. She completely bypassed the long line of everyday customers waiting patiently for the tellers. She marched straight toward the frosted glass office of the branch manager, a man named Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell had been my personal financial advisor for over a decade. He knew every single detail of my financial history, and more importantly, he knew exactly what Diane had done. He called me immediately after she left the building, recounting every detail of her spectacular downfall. Diane pushed the office door open without bothering to knock. She slammed her expensive designer handbag onto Mr. Caldwell's polished mahogany desk. "I demand that you lift the restrictions on my accounts this very second," she ordered. Her voice was harsh and loud enough to bleed through the glass walls, effectively silencing the entire lobby outside. "My husband is playing a childish and illegal game with my finances. I am his legal wife and I have 50% ownership of every single penny in this institution. You will reactivate my credit cards and you will authorize a cash withdrawal of $10,000 immediately, or I will personally make sure you lose your job by the end of the day." Mr. Caldwell did not flinch. He did not quickly reach for his keyboard to accommodate her demands the way he used to, when she was backed by my wealth. He simply folded his hands neatly on top of his pristine desk. He looked at her with the polite, empty expression reserved entirely for hostile strangers. "Please lower your voice and take a seat," he said calmly. Diane refused to sit down. She stood towering over his desk, breathing heavily, trying to physically intimidate a man who now held all the absolute power. Mr. Caldwell slowly opened a thick manila folder sitting in front of him. He withdrew a single sheet of paper and turned it around so she could read the harsh black text. "I cannot authorize any withdrawals for you because you no longer have any active funds at this institution, Mr. Caldwell explained. His voice was completely devoid of sympathy. "Your husband came into my office yesterday afternoon. He presented incontrovertible video and physical evidence of criminal forgery regarding the $200,000 loan you initiated. Following our strict federal fraud protocols, he legally removed his name and his incoming direct deposits from all joint accounts. He severed his financial liability completely. Those accounts are no longer joint. They belong solely and exclusively to you." Diane scoffed loudly, waving her hand dismissively at the official bank document. "That is completely ridiculous and legally impossible," she argued passionately. "You cannot just remove a husband from a joint account without the wife signing a formal release. We are legally married. His money is my money. I know my legal rights in this state, and I will sue this entire bank." Mr. Caldwell calmly adjusted his glasses. "You are entirely incorrect," he stated flatly. "Under the specific terms of the fraud protocol initiated yesterday, the primary income earner can absolutely isolate their funds to prevent further criminal theft. Furthermore, the accounts were not closed. They remain open under your name alone. Because you continued to attempt large purchases yesterday evening and early this morning at a luxury hotel while simultaneously having several high-value automatic payments, you have severely overdrawn the accounts." Diane felt the blood rushing to her ears. Her legs suddenly felt weak. She finally lowered herself into the leather chair opposite the desk. "What exactly are you saying to me?" she whispered. Her arrogant facade was beginning to crack violently under the weight of the banking terminology. "I am saying that you currently have a negative balance of exactly $14,600, Mr. Caldwell clarified. He tapped his silver pen against the paper to emphasize the number. "The attempted hotel charges the returned country club membership fees, and the bounced luxury car payments have all incurred severe daily penalty fees. Because Richard completely removed his financial backing, our institution is holding you entirely and personally responsible for this massive debt. You do not have a single cent here. You owe us a very significant amount of money." Diane stared blindly at the negative numbers printed on the official bank letterhead. The quiet office began to spin around her. She tried desperately to formulate a demand, a threat, or anything to regain control of the narrative. But there was absolutely nothing left to leverage. She had always used my immense wealth as a blunt weapon to force people into submission. Now sitting in the cold, air-conditioned room, she realized she was completely unarmed. "If you do not deposit funds to clear this negative balance within 3 business days, Mr. Caldwell continued relentlessly, "we will be forced to send your accounts to a predatory collections agency. We will also report the severe delinquency to all major credit bureaus. Your perfect credit score will be entirely decimated by the end of the week. Now, if you do not have a cashier's check to cover this $14,000 debt today, I must ask you to leave my office immediately. I have paying clients waiting." Diane could not speak a single word. The impenetrable legal protection she thought the title of wife provided was a complete illusion. She stood up slowly on shaking legs. She grabbed her designer handbag, which suddenly felt incredibly heavy and entirely useless. She walked out of the manager's office in total silence. She did not look at the bank tellers. She did not look at the ordinary customers in the lobby who were openly staring at her humiliation. She walked through the heavy glass doors and out into the harsh sunlight, carrying a massive financial burden she had no possible way to pay. I had not just taken my money away from her. I had turned her own aggressive spending habits into a lethal financial trap, and Mr. Caldwell had just permanently locked the door behind her. Diane sat in the illegally parked car outside the bank, her hands gripping the leather steering wheel. The reality of the massive debt crushed her chest. But Diane was not a woman who accepted defeat gracefully. She was a predator who had just lost her hunting ground. She needed fast cash to survive the weekend. She immediately remembered my vintage watch collection. Over 30 years, I had meticulously curated a collection of rare mechanical timepieces. Because of their immense value, I kept them in a highly secure, climate-controlled storage facility across town. Diane knew the entry passcode to the main gate. She also possessed a duplicate brass key to the specific unit. She calculated in her frantic mind that selling just 3 of those watches to a quiet pawnbroker would easily clear her bank debt. It would also leave her with enough cash to hire a ruthless attorney to destroy me. She started the engine and drove aggressively toward the industrial district. She was actively plotting a grand theft, but in her deeply distorted mind, she was simply reclaiming assets she believed she deserved. The storage facility was a modern fortress of poured concrete and reinforced steel. Diane confidently punched the memorized 6-digit code into the electronic keypad at the front security gate. The heavy iron gate slid open with a mechanical hum. She drove down the long corridors of identical orange doors until she reached my unit at the very back of the property. She stepped out of the luxury vehicle, tightly clutching the small brass key in her hand. She walked up to the rolling metal door, a triumphant and malicious smile beginning to form on her face. She raised the key to the locking mechanism. Her smile vanished in an instant. The standard brass padlock she expected to see was entirely gone. In its place was a massive commercial-grade steel cylinder lock. It was a heavy-duty biometric mechanism that required a specialized fingerprint scan and a magnetic key card. Her copied brass key was completely useless against it. She grabbed the heavy steel housing and rattled it violently against the door, completely consumed by frustration and rising panic. "Please step away from that unit immediately," a stern voice echoed down the long concrete corridor. Diane spun around. The facility manager, a tall man wearing a crisp security uniform, was walking swiftly toward her. He was accompanied by a large armed security guard who kept his hand resting casually near his radio. "I demand that you open this unit right now," Diane shouted, reverting instantly to her default state of arrogant entitlement. "My husband lost his access card, and I need to retrieve my personal belongings for a trip." The manager did not smile. He did not reach for a set of master keys. He stopped a few feet away from her and pulled a thick, folded document from his metal clipboard. "Mr. Dalton did not lose his access card," the manager stated firmly. "Mr. Dalton upgraded his security package to our maximum tier yesterday afternoon. He also explicitly directed us to remove your name from the authorized access registry." Diane opened her mouth to scream a threat, but the manager held up his hand to silence her. He extended the folded legal document toward her chest. Furthermore, the manager continued, his voice echoing coldly against the metal walls. "Mr. Dalton provided us with a copy of this legal injunction. A county judge signed an emergency temporary restraining order early this morning. It legally prohibits you from coming within 500 feet of Mr. Dalton, his place of employment, or any of his secured properties. This facility is a secured commercial property." Diane stared blindly at the paper in his hand. The official blue seal of the city court was stamped heavily at the bottom. She did not reach out to take it. "If you do not leave the premises in exactly 60 seconds, the manager warned, I am legally obligated to contact law enforcement and have you arrested for criminal trespassing and violating a court order." Diane looked at the impenetrable steel lock and then at the armed guard staring her down. I had anticipated her exact thought process. I knew she would try to liquidate my most valuable assets the moment the money ran out. I had built an invisible legal wall around my property before she even realized she was at war. She turned around and walked back to the car in absolute humiliating defeat. While Diane was suffering her public humiliation at the storage facility, the reality of their sudden financial ruin was violently infecting the rest of their immediate circle. Todd, the arrogant fiancé of my stepdaughter Brittany, was having a spectacularly bad afternoon. Todd was a man who measured his entire worth by the brand of his watch, the logo on his leased sports car, and the artificial status he projected to his wealthy clients at the luxury car dealership. He had proposed to Brittany entirely because he believed she was the sole heir to my substantial estate. Yesterday, he truly thought he was marrying into a lifetime of effortless millions. Today, the illusion had been shattered completely. He had been forced to pay for their squalid roadside motel room, using his own overextended high-interest credit card after they fled my house in absolute panic. He was furious. He felt utterly foolish. He decided that the only way to restore his damaged ego and secure his financial future was to confront an old man and bully him into immediate submission. My engineering firm is located in a massive high-rise building in the absolute center of the city financial district. I am the senior partner and the chief structural engineer. I park my vehicle in a private subterranean garage reserved exclusively for the executive staff. It is a quiet, dimly lit concrete cavern that echoes only with the sound of luxury engines and expensive leather shoes. Security is usually incredibly tight, designed to keep aggressive elements out. At exactly 5 o'clock in the evening, I packed up my leather briefcase, locked my office door, and took the private executive elevator down to the basement level. I was physically exhausted, but deeply satisfied with the surgical precision of the day's events. I stepped out of the elevator and walked steadily toward my designated parking space. The air was cool and smelled faintly of motor oil and damp concrete. I pressed the button on my key fob, listening for the familiar sound of my car doors unlocking. Before my hand could even reach the handle, a heavy shadow detached itself from the large concrete support pillar right next to my vehicle. It was Todd. He had somehow bypassed the external security gate, likely by aggressively tailgating another executive into the lower level before the barrier could close. He was wearing his shiny, cheap salesman suit, but his face was twisted into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked completely out of place in this environment of quiet, calculated authority. He marched directly into my personal space, practically vibrating with a toxic, aggressive energy. He planted his expensive leather shoes firmly on the ground, completely blocking my path to the driver's side door. He puffed out his chest and rolled his shoulders back, actively attempting to use his youth and his physical size to intimidate a man who had spent his entire life calculating the exact point where pressure causes a foundation to crack. "Look at me when I am talking to you, old man," Todd growled. His voice echoed harshly in the empty, silent garage. "You have really lost your mind this time. Do you have any idea the kind of massive mess you created today? Brittany has been crying uncontrollably in a disgusting motel room for 5 straight hours. Diane is practically having a nervous breakdown. I had to pay for their room out of my own pocket because you decided to play stupid games with their bank accounts." I looked at him with absolute unwavering indifference. I did not step back. I did not flinch away from his aggression. I simply held my leather briefcase firmly in one hand and my car keys in the other. "I am not playing games, Todd," I replied calmly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am simply closing the vault. If you are angry about paying for their motel room, you should take that up with your future wife. She is the one who conspired to forge a federal banking document." Todd's face turned a violent, ugly shade of crimson. He absolutely could not handle the complete lack of fear in my eyes. He fully expected me to cower. He expected me to offer a frantic apology or beg for a compromise just to avoid a physical altercation. Instead, I gave him nothing but cold, absolute, undeniable facts. He took another aggressive step forward, entirely closing the final distance between us, until I could smell the cheap, overwhelming cologne radiating off his suit jacket. "You are going to fix this right now," Todd demanded, his voice dropping into a deeply menacing whisper. "You are going to give them their money back. and you are going to apologize to my fiancé, or you and I are going to have a very serious problem right here in this parking lot." Todd lost the final shred of his fragile self-control. He could not process my absolute refusal to engage in his emotional chaos. He closed the remaining gap between us with a sudden and violent lunge. He grabbed the lapels of my tailored suit jacket with both of his shaking hands, his knuckles turning white from the strain. With a grunt of raw and unrefined exertion, he shoved me aggressively backward. My shoulder blades slammed against the rough, cold surface of the massive concrete support pillar behind my vehicle. The sudden impact forced a sharp, involuntary breath from my lungs. My leather briefcase slipped from my fingers and hit the cement floor with a heavy, hollow thud. Todd immediately pressed his thick forearm directly across my chest, pinning me firmly to the pillar. He was panting heavily, his face mere inches from mine, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. He expected me to struggle wildly. He expected the natural, pathetic panic of an older man being physically overpowered by a younger and stronger attacker. I gave him absolutely nothing of the sort. I simply looked at his sweating face with clinical detachment. I analyzed his stance in the dim light. His physical weight was entirely unbalanced, driven by pure emotional rage rather than calculated deliberate force. He was fundamentally a weak man, pretending to be an apex predator. "You are going to listen to me very carefully right now," Todd hissed. He spoke so aggressively that small drops of saliva sprayed onto my cheek. "You are going to walk upstairs to your fancy executive office this instant. You are going to log into whatever secret offshore bank accounts you have hidden from your wife all these years. Tomorrow morning you are going to hand me a certified cashier check for exactly $50,000. That is the strict price for my silence. That is the mandatory cost for me to take Brittany and Diane off your hands and walk away from this disaster quietly." Todd smiled a sickening, deeply arrogant expression that revealed the absolute depths of his greed. He truly believed he had just executed a masterclass in high-stakes negotiation. He thought $50,000 was a profound and crippling ransom. He was entirely unaware that I routinely approved material engineering budgets 50 times that size before my morning coffee. He pressed his forearm harder against my collarbone, attempting to inflict actual physical pain to punctuate his amateur extortion demand. I remained perfectly still against the cold concrete. I did not raise my hands to fight him off. I did not attempt to push his arm away. "Your mathematical calculations and your tactical approach are both deeply flawed," I told him calmly. "You are demanding a massive financial settlement for a catastrophic family crisis that you actively helped create." The sound of my steady, entirely fearless voice infuriated him further than my initial silence had. His arrogant smile vanished instantly. The thick veins in his neck bulged prominently against his tight shirt collar. "If you do not give me that check by noon tomorrow, I will destroy your entire pathetic life," Todd threatened. His voice echoed loudly across the cavernous, empty parking garage, bouncing off the concrete walls. "I will walk right back into this commercial building tomorrow morning. I will go directly up to the executive board of directors of your prestigious engineering firm. I will tell them exactly what kind of monster they employ. I will tell them that their senior partner is a financially abusive psychopath who maliciously threw his sick wife and stepdaughter out onto the street without a single penny. I will tell them you are stealing money from your own family and hoarding it like a tyrant." He was practically shouting now, completely drunk on the illusion of his own leverage. "I will go directly to your biggest corporate clients," Todd continued relentlessly. "I will schedule meetings with the city planners and the construction magnates who implicitly trust you. I will tell them you are mentally unstable, increasingly senile, and completely incapable of managing their massive infrastructure projects. I will drag your pristine name through the mud in every high society circle in this city. I will burn your professional reputation to the absolute ground until your own partners are forced to vote you into early retirement in total humiliating disgrace." He laid out his entire extortion plot with absolute undeniable clarity. He explicitly detailed his premeditated intent to commit criminal blackmail, professional character assassination, and corporate sabotage, all while he was actively committing a physical assault against me. He was so completely consumed by his own fabricated sense of ultimate power that he forgot exactly where he was standing. He forgot that he was trespassing in a subterranean vault, owned by a massive corporate entity that valued absolute security above everything else. I listened to his pathetic, escalating threats with the cold detachment of a structural engineer observing a deeply flawed architectural blueprint. He was not a sophisticated criminal mastermind orchestrating a flawless heist. He was a desperate, drowning man, flailing wildly in the dark, trying to pull anyone he could reach down into the freezing water with him. He genuinely believed that the mere threat of public embarrassment and corporate gossip would completely shatter my resolve. He thought a man who had spent 40 rigorous years building indestructible steel bridges would somehow crumble under the weight of a local car salesman and his petty blackmail. He loosened his physical grip on my chest, just slightly stepping back half a pace, eagerly waiting for my inevitable surrender. He waited for me to panic. He waited for me to beg him to keep his voice down and protect my distinguished career. He waited for me to blindly agree to his extortion out of pure terror. Instead, I quietly prepared to show him exactly what happens when you attempt to demolish a solid foundation without first surveying the environment. Todd stood there breathing heavily, entirely convinced he had won. He kept his thick forearm pressed aggressively against my chest, waiting for the inevitable apology and the promise of the massive $50,000 check. In his limited experience as a manipulative car salesman, physical intimidation always yielded immediate and satisfying results. People usually crumpled when their personal space was violently invaded. They panicked when threatened with public humiliation. But I did not crumple. I did not break eye contact. I let a long, heavy, suffocating silence stretch between us in the dim garage, allowing his adrenaline to slowly curdle into profound confusion. The frantic energy radiating from his body was practically vibrating, but it was meeting a solid, impenetrable wall of absolute, undisturbed calm. I could see the exact moment the doubt began to creep into his shallow mind. His breathing hitched slightly. His physical grip faltered by just a fraction of an inch. He realized that a man who was genuinely terrified would be speaking by now, offering frantic excuses or pleading for mercy. Instead, I simply looked at him, as if he were a particularly slow child who had wandered blindly into a highly restricted construction zone. Then very slowly, I allowed a smile to form on my face. It was not a warm or forgiving smile. It was a cold, calculated expression of pure, predatory amusement. It was the distinct smile of an experienced chess player who has just watched his arrogant opponent willingly walk into an inescapable checkmate. Todd recoiled slightly at the sight of it, though he tried desperately to mask his hesitation by puffing out his chest even further. "What is so funny, old man?" he demanded loudly. His voice had lost its confident, threatening edge and was now clearly tinged with genuine uncertainty. He was no longer dictating the terms of this encounter. He had surrendered total control the moment he let his violent emotions override his basic logic. I slowly raised my right hand. I did not ball it into a defensive fist. I simply extended my index finger and pointed deliberately toward the dark concrete ceiling directly above his head. "You really should have done your basic research before you decided to assault a senior partner in his own private facility," I said smoothly. My voice was quiet and perfectly controlled, forcing him to strain slightly to hear every devastating word. "I am a structural engineer, Todd. I design highly secure environments for Federal Reserve banks and top-tier corporate entities. Security is my absolute specialty. Exactly 3 weeks ago, my firm completed a massive $1 million security upgrade for this entire subterranean parking structure. I pointed specifically to a small, sleek, black dome mounted flush against the concrete crossbeam, just 10 feet away from us. That is a commercial-grade 4K resolution security camera, I explained to him, with clinical precision. It is equipped with advanced low-light sensors and military-grade facial recognition software. It does not just record high-definition video, Todd. It is integrated with highly sensitive directional audio microphones specifically designed to pick up whispers over the echoing sound of idling car engines. Todd slowly turned his head to look up at the black dome. The small, continuously blinking red LED light in the center of the dark lens confirmed absolutely everything I was saying. The heavy forearm pinning me to the concrete pillar suddenly felt very weak and entirely useless. Every single word of your pathetic extortion demand, I continued relentlessly every specific threat to maliciously sabotage my corporate career, and every physical shove you just executed has been recorded in pristine quality. That footage is not stored on a local tape that you can conveniently smash. It is actively uploading in real time to an encrypted off-site cloud server, monitored 24 hours a day by an independent private security firm. I did not need to fight you physically, Todd. You just voluntarily handed me all the necessary evidence I need to send you to federal prison for a very long time. Blackmail, extortion, and assault are severe felonies in this state. The blood completely drained from his face in an instant. His arrogant artificial tan was replaced by a sickly pale white hue. He pulled his arm away from my chest as if the fine wool fabric of my suit had suddenly caught fire. He took 3 rapid, stumbling steps backward, his eyes darting frantically between my calm face and the silent, unblinking eye of the security camera above. The entire illusion of his physical dominance evaporated into the damp air. He was no longer the apex predator demanding a king's ransom. He was a small, foolish man who had just recorded his own undeniable felony confession. I bent down entirely unbothered and picked up my leather briefcase from the concrete floor. I brushed a small speck of dust from my lapel. I did not yell. I did not gloat. I simply delivered the final crushing blow. The off-site security monitoring team is legally required to dispatch local law enforcement the absolute second a physical altercation is detected on the premises. I informed him calmly. I estimate you have roughly 3 minutes before the police officially seal the exits to this garage. Have a wonderful evening, Todd. I stood in the quiet concrete expanse of the parking garage and watched Todd sprint toward the exit stairwell. He moved with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a prey animal that had just realized it was trapped in a cage. I did not chase him. I did not need to. I walked back to my vehicle, placed my briefcase on the passenger seat, and opened my laptop. I accessed the security mainframe and downloaded the pristine high-definition video file of his assault and his explicit extortion demands. I did not just wait for the automated monitoring service to file a routine report. I attached the video file to a direct email addressed to a senior detective at the city precinct, a man I had worked with extensively during the structural planning of the new police headquarters. I typed a brief factual description of the felony assault and blackmail. I hit send, started my car, and drove home to enjoy a quiet, undisturbed dinner. The very next morning, Todd attempted to return to his artificial life, as if he had not just committed multiple felonies on camera. He worked at an exclusive luxury auto dealership located in the wealthiest district of the city. The showroom was a pristine temple of polished white marble and floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Todd stood on the showroom floor wearing a brand-new, sharply tailored suit, desperately trying to project an aura of effortless success. He was actively negotiating the sale of a $200,000 sports car with a prominent local surgeon. His general manager, a strict man who demanded absolute perfection from his sales team, was watching the transaction closely from a glass office. Todd kept checking his expensive watch, sweating profusely under the bright showroom lights, waiting for a courier to arrive with the $50,000 cashier check he still foolishly believed I would send. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the consequences of his extreme arrogance arrived. 2 marked police cruisers pulled aggressively into the pristine circular driveway of the dealership. They did not use their sirens, but the flashing red and blue lights reflected blindingly against the massive glass windows of the showroom, instantly drawing the attention of every single employee and wealthy client inside. 3 uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicles. They did not walk to the reception desk to ask politely for an interview. They marched directly onto the showroom floor, their heavy black boots echoing loudly against the polished marble. They bypassed the expensive inventory and walked straight toward Todd, who was standing perfectly still, the color completely draining from his face. The surgeon he was trying to impress stepped back in absolute alarm. "Are you Todd Mitchell?" the lead officer asked, in a loud, commanding voice that carried across the entire silent room. Todd could not even formulate a lie. He simply nodded his head, his hands beginning to shake violently. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the officer instructed firmly. "You are under arrest for felony attempted extortion, criminal blackmail, and physical assault." The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed like a gunshot in the quiet showroom. Every single person in the building was staring at him. The illusion of wealth and untouchable status he had meticulously cultivated his entire adult life shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces. His general manager burst out of his glass office, his face red with fury. He did not ask the police for an explanation. He looked directly at Todd with absolute disgust. "You are fired immediately," the manager stated coldly, loud enough for the officers and the clients to hear. "I want his desk cleared out and his personal items thrown in the dumpster. Do not ever set foot on this property again." The officers escorted Todd out of the building. They paraded him in handcuffs past his stunned colleagues, past the wealthy clients he desperately wanted to emulate, and pushed him roughly into the back of the police cruiser in broad daylight. The heavy door slammed shut, locking him in the dark, caged back seat. He was no longer a high-end salesman engaged to a wealthy heiress. He was an unemployed criminal facing years in a federal penitentiary, entirely because he thought he could intimidate a structural engineer in a parking garage. 3 hours later, Todd was standing in a cold concrete holding cell at the county jail. He was granted a single telephone call. He did not call a bail bondsman. He did not call an attorney. He called Brittany. She answered the phone from the squalid, cheap motel room she was sharing with her mother, expecting Todd to announce that he had successfully secured my money. Instead, she was met with an explosion of pure, unadulterated venom. The automated voice recording, announcing a call from an inmate at the county correctional facility, barely finished before Todd began screaming through the receiver. "You absolute parasite!" Todd roared into the jailhouse phone, completely ignoring the other inmates watching him. "Your entire family is a toxic disease. I am sitting in a concrete cage facing federal prison time because I tried to fix the massive disaster you and your psychotic mother created." Brittany tried to interrupt, tried to ask what had happened, but Todd did not let her speak a single word. "Do not ever contact me again," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic and raw fury. "The wedding is completely cancelled. You have absolutely nothing. You are completely broke, your mother is a criminal, and I am not going to let you drag me down to the bottom of the ocean with you. Do not call my family, do not write to me, and stay the hell away from me." He slammed the heavy plastic receiver onto the metal hook with brutal force, officially severing their alliance. In a single violently executed phone call, the united front against me was entirely destroyed. Brittany was left sitting on the edge of a stained motel mattress, holding a silent phone, completely isolated, utterly abandoned, and finally realizing that the absolute worst was still yet to come. Diane was completely cornered. The luxurious, untouchable life she believed was her absolute birthright had been entirely dismantled in less than 48 hours. She was sitting on the sagging, stained mattress of a cheap roadside motel, listening to the constant roar of the nearby interstate highway. The stark contrast between the imported Italian marble of my foyer and the peeling wallpaper of this squalid room was driving her to the brink of true madness. She finally realized her aggressive, entitled tactics had completely failed her. She could not bully a seasoned bank manager into submission. She could not intimidate an armed security guard at a storage facility. She had zero financial leverage and zero social power. She needed a new weapon. She needed someone who weaponized the legal system for a living. She used the last few $100s of her hidden emergency cash to hire an attorney who perfectly matched her own complete lack of a moral compass. His name was Warren Trent. Warren was not a respected partner at a prestigious, quiet downtown law firm. He was a high-volume, relentlessly aggressive divorce litigator who advertised heavily on giant roadside billboards. He specialized entirely in extracting massive financial settlements through sheer, unyielding legal harassment and character assassination. Diane walked into his cramped, poorly lit office the next morning, wearing the last clean designer dress she owned. She immediately deployed the only strategy she had left in her arsenal. She played the innocent, helpless victim. She sat across the desk from Warren Trent and spun a completely fabricated, deeply malicious narrative. She wept convincingly, using tears she had likely practiced in the motel mirror. She claimed that for 15 long years, I had held her entirely captive in a gilded cage. She told him that I was a severe, financially abusive tyrant who controlled every single penny she spent, tracking her daily movements and systematically isolating her from her friends and family. She completely omitted the forged power of attorney. She entirely erased her recent documented attempt to steal a $200,000 loan against my property. Instead, she claimed I had suffered a sudden violent mental breakdown, abruptly emptying all of our joint accounts and throwing her and her innocent daughter onto the street without a single word of warning or a dollar to feed themselves. Warren Trent did not ask for corroborating evidence. He did not care about the objective truth or the glaring inconsistencies in her story. He looked at Diane and saw a highly lucrative opportunity. He heard that I was a senior partner at a massive, successful structural engineering firm, and his eyes practically gleamed with unadulterated greed. He calculated my potential net worth in his head and decided immediately that I was a soft, wealthy, older target. He assumed I would gladly pay a massive, quiet settlement just to make a loud, embarrassing public scandal disappear. He assured Diane that he would completely ruin my life. He promised to freeze my corporate assets, drag my professional name through the mud, and force me to pay for her extravagant lifestyle until the day I died. Within 24 hours, Warren Trent filed an aggressive emergency motion for divorce and immediate spousal support in the county family court. It was a masterpiece of absolute legal fiction. The document was 40 pages long, filled with explosive, entirely fabricated allegations designed specifically to shock a judge into immediate blind action. The motion formally requested a staggering $15,000 a month in temporary alimony. It demanded exclusive access and occupation of the marital home, the immediate return of the seized luxury vehicles, and a massive preliminary injunction against my engineering firm to prevent me from hiding my supposed secret offshore wealth. The legal filing painted me as a dangerous, unstable monster who had maliciously abandoned his dedicated, loving wife, leaving her completely destitute and terrified for her physical safety. I was sitting at my large oak desk in my private office when the legal process server arrived. My secretary, looking incredibly uncomfortable and deeply apologetic, ushered the man into the room. He handed me the thick manila envelope containing the emergency summons and the fabricated motion. I signed the official receipt of delivery with a perfectly steady hand. I waited until my office door clicked shut before I opened the envelope. I sat in the quiet, temperature-controlled comfort of my office and read every single vicious lie Diane had sworn under penalty of perjury. I read her arrogant demands for my house, my salary, and my absolute submission. A lesser man would have been utterly consumed by panic. A weaker man would have immediately called his wife and begged for a quiet, expensive settlement to keep those horrific, career-ending accusations out of the public court record. Diane and her sleazy attorney were entirely counting on that exact reaction. They wanted me to surrender out of pure fear of social and professional embarrassment. But I did not feel fear. I felt a profound, cold clarity. I analyzed their legal filing the same way I analyze a deeply flawed architectural blueprint. I saw every single structural weakness in their lies. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the private number of my own legal counsel. Diane wanted a brutal war in a public courtroom, genuinely believing her fabricated tears would outshine my documented truth. She was completely unaware that she had just handed me the exact legal mechanism I needed to completely and permanently destroy her. 72 hours after the disastrous confrontation in my foyer, we found ourselves inside the sterile, intimidating environment of the county family court. The building was a massive structure of cold granite and polished concrete, designed to make everyone inside feel incredibly small. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors of courtroom number 4, alongside my personal attorney, Mitchell Bradley. Mitchell was not a loud, aggressive billboard lawyer. He was a deeply analytical corporate litigator who specialized in complex financial destruction. We wore impeccable dark-tailored suits. We carried a single heavy leather briefcase. We walked to the respondent's table in total silence and sat down. Diane was already seated at the petitioner's table across the center aisle. Her physical transformation was a masterclass in absolute manipulation. The arrogant, designer-clad woman who had tried to bully the bank manager was completely gone. She wore a plain, remarkably cheap gray cardigan over a faded blouse. She had purposefully removed all of her expensive jewelry, including the 3-carat diamond anniversary ring I had purchased for her just last year. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, messy knot. She sat with her shoulders hunched forward, clutching a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands, actively dabbing at her dry eyes. She was playing the role of the battered, terrified, destitute housewife with terrifying dedication. Her attorney, Warren Trent, sat right beside her. He looked incredibly smug. He leaned back in his wooden chair, occasionally whispering to Diane and nodding with aggressive confidence. He looked across the aisle at me and actually smiled. He truly believed I was just another wealthy, guilty older man who would crumble under the terrifying pressure of a public court hearing. He thought my silence was an admission of pure terror. He assumed my stoic posture was merely a fragile facade covering a deep, desperate desire to settle this matter quietly out of the public eye. The bailiff announced the arrival of the Honorable Judge Patricia Collins. She was an older woman with sharp, unforgiving eyes and a reputation for possessing absolutely zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. She took her seat behind the elevated mahogany bench and opened the massive 40-page motion Warren Trent had filed. The courtroom fell perfectly silent as she quickly scanned the initial pages, her expression completely unreadable. Counselor Trent, you filed an emergency motion for absolute financial support and exclusive property occupation, Judge Collins stated flatly. Her voice echoed sharply in the large room, commanding immediate respect. Please state your primary arguments for the official court record. Warren Trent stood up immediately. He practically leaped out of his chair, eager to begin his theatrical performance. He buttoned his suit jacket and walked slowly toward the center of the room, puffing out his chest. Your Honor, we are here today to rescue a woman who has been systematically abused and maliciously abandoned, Trent began. His voice was loud, booming, and filled with manufactured righteous indignation. For 15 years, my client Diane has been a devoted, loving, and entirely subservient wife to a man who controlled her every single movement. Trent paced back and forth across the polished floor, gesturing wildly toward where I sat, in absolute silence. 3 days ago, without any provocation whatsoever, Mr. Dalton suffered a severe, violent mental break, Trent continued relentlessly. He maliciously severed all financial support. He illegally locked my client out of her own bank accounts. He canceled the insurance policies on her vehicles, and he actively threatened her physical safety, forcing her to flee her own marital home in pure terror. She is currently living in a dangerous, squalid roadside motel, unable to even afford basic groceries, while her husband sits on a massive, hidden corporate fortune. Diane let out a loud, pathetic sob at the exact mention of the motel. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking rhythmically. It was a spectacular, sickening display of calculated victimhood designed specifically to manipulate the emotions of the court. "Your Honor, we are demanding immediate and absolute intervention from this court," Trent declared, raising his voice to ensure his absolute dominance over the room. "We demand an emergency spousal support order in the exact amount of $15,000 per month to cover her basic living expenses and secure safe housing. Furthermore, we demand the immediate and exclusive occupation of the primary marital residence, and we request a comprehensive court-ordered freeze on all of Mr. Dalton's corporate accounts to prevent him from continuing to hide marital assets offshore. We must protect this vulnerable woman from a tyrannical, financially abusive predator before he destroys her completely." Warren Trent finished his bombastic speech and returned to his table looking incredibly satisfied with himself. He patted Diane gently on the shoulder, playing the role of the ultimate noble protector. He had painted a horrific, vivid picture for the judge. He had successfully delivered every single lie Diane had fed him, demanding my absolute financial ruin based entirely on a fabricated narrative of cruelty. He sat down and looked across the aisle at my lawyer, fully expecting Mitchell Bradley to stand up and frantically object, or beg the judge for a brief recess to discuss a quiet financial settlement. I did not panic. I did not glare at Diane. I simply turned my head and looked at Mitchell. He was perfectly calm. He rested his hands lightly on the polished wooden table. He did not object to a single word Warren Trent had said. He had let the man speak entirely uninterrupted, allowing him to put every single malicious lie directly onto the official, permanent court record. The trap was now fully constructed, and Trent had just enthusiastically locked the steel door from the inside. The echo of Warren Trent and his ridiculous demands faded into the high ceilings of the courtroom. Judge Collins turned her sharp, uncompromising gaze to our table, fully expecting a frantic and highly emotional rebuttal. She expected me to defend my honor, or vehemently deny the horrific allegations of abuse. Mitchell Bradley did not jump to his feet. He took his absolute time. He slowly closed his silver fountain pen, placed it perfectly parallel to his yellow legal pad, and stood up with the quiet, terrifying grace of an apex predator. He did not pace around the room. He stood firmly behind his heavy wooden chair, radiating an aura of absolute corporate authority. "Your Honor," Mitchell began, his voice completely devoid of theatrical emotion. "We have thoroughly reviewed the emergency motion filed by the petitioner. We do not object to the dissolution of this marriage. In fact, Mr. Dalton enthusiastically welcomes the immediate termination of all legal ties to this woman. We fully agree that a divorce is the only appropriate and necessary remedy for this disastrous situation." The entire courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. Diane snapped her head up violently, dropping her crumpled tissue directly into her lap. Her manufactured tears vanished instantly, replaced by genuine, unadulterated shock. She had heavily relied on my deeply ingrained sense of traditional duty. She truly believed I would fight desperately to maintain the public facade of our family, just as I had done for 15 exhausting years. Warren Trent practically choked on his own breath. He gripped the edge of his table, his arrogant, predatory smile completely wiped from his sweating face. He had expected a highly lucrative, drawn-out negotiation process. He did not expect total, immediate capitulation to the divorce itself. Judge Collins leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued by our complete lack of resistance. She peered over her wire-rimmed reading glasses at Mitchell. "If you are stipulating to the divorce counselor," she stated slowly, "are you also stipulating to the temporary spousal support and the exclusive occupation of the primary residence?" "Absolutely not, Your Honor," Mitchell replied smoothly. "We are firmly objecting to every single financial demand made in that entirely fabricated document. Furthermore, we are requesting that this court immediately refer the petitioner to the district attorney for severe criminal prosecution regarding her blatant perjury today." Mitchell reached down and unlatched the heavy brass locks of his leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the painfully quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a massive, professionally bound document. It was 400 pages of high-gloss paper, meticulously organized with colored tabs and held together by thick metal rings. He did not hand it to a junior bailiff. He walked deliberately across the well of the courtroom and placed the heavy volume directly onto the elevated mahogany bench in front of Judge Collins. It landed with a loud, incredibly satisfying thud. "That, Your Honor, is a comprehensive forensic accounting report," Mitchell explained. "It was compiled over the last 72 hours by an independent team of certified fraud examiners and highly specialized financial investigators. It details every single transaction, every hidden asset, and every malicious, calculated lie the petitioner has constructed over the last 12 months." Judge Collins opened the thick black cover. She immediately began reading the executive summary. Warren Trent stood up, his face flushing a violent, unhealthy shade of red. "Your Honor, I vehemently object to this ambush," Trent stammered loudly, his confident posture completely shattered. "We have not been provided a copy of this supposed evidence. It is highly prejudicial to introduce this massive document without prior discovery." Mitchell did not even look at him. He simply reached into his briefcase again, pulled out an identical 400-page copy, and dropped it heavily onto Trent's table. It landed mere inches from Diane's trembling hands. "You have your copy now," Counselor Mitchell said coldly. "I strongly suggest you read it very carefully before you decide to speak again on behalf of your client." Judge Collins ignored Trent entirely. Her eyes were darting rapidly across the printed pages, her judicial expression hardening into pure ice with every passing second. Mitchell began to narrate the absolute financial destruction of Diane's carefully constructed illusion. Page 12 of that report, Your Honor, contains the certified bank transaction logs and high-definition security footage from exactly 3 weeks ago, Mitchell stated, projecting his voice so everyone in the gallery could hear. "It definitively proves that Diane Dalton physically entered the main branch of my client's bank. She presented a completely forged power of attorney document falsely and maliciously claiming her husband was permanently incapacitated in a cardiac ward." Diane let out a small, terrified gasp. She sank much lower in her wooden chair, desperately wishing the polished concrete floor would open up and swallow her completely. Using that forged federal document, Mitchell continued relentlessly. The petitioner successfully secured a $200,000 loan against the equity of a home that was entirely owned by my client prior to this marriage. Mr. Trent just stood in this very courtroom and boldly claimed his client was entirely destitute, unable to buy basic groceries, and living in squalor because of my client. However, the forensic trace located on page 45 shows exactly where that stolen money went. It did not go to household expenses. It was not used to pay off imaginary marital debts. Within 24 hours of the loan clearing the bank, the entire sum was secretly wired into a private corporate account. Mitchell took a single deliberate step toward Diane. He looked down at her with pure, unmasked disgust. "That corporate account belongs to a newly formed, limited liability company, registered discreetly in the state of Delaware," Mitchell revealed to the court. "The sole managing member and primary financial beneficiary of that secret shell company is Diane Dalton. The signature on the formation documents matches her handwriting perfectly." Warren Trent slowly sat down in his chair. He looked at Diane not as a sympathetic victim, but as a highly toxic liability who had just tricked him into submitting a perjured motion to a furious judge. His career was suddenly flashing before his eyes. She did not stop there. "Your Honor," Mitchell continued, driving the final nail into her coffin. "On page 80 of the report, you will find the final destination of those stolen funds. Exactly 2 weeks ago, while my client was recovering from a severe medical emergency, that shell company purchased a luxury 2-bedroom condominium located in the wealthiest downtown district of this city. The deed is fully recorded. The property was purchased entirely in cash using the stolen loan money, and the sole individual listed on the deed as the permanent resident of that luxury condo is Brittany, the adult daughter of the petitioner." The silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. The entire narrative of the helpless, abused, and destitute wife had just been completely incinerated in front of the judge. "She is not a victim," Mitchell declared, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "She is a highly calculated, remorseless financial predator. She forged federal banking documents. She actively stole a massive sum of money to purchase hidden luxury real estate for her adult daughter. She then came into this court today, sat under the strict penalty of perjury, and demanded that my client pay an additional $15,000 a month to fund the very lifestyle she attempted to steal from him." Mitchell turned his back on Diane and addressed the bench one final time. "She is not destitute, Your Honor. She currently owns a fully paid $200,000 piece of real estate that was purchased with stolen funds. We respectfully request that this court immediately deny all requests for spousal support, deny the request for exclusive occupation of the marital home, and place an immediate judicial freeze on the property she fraudulently acquired, so we may begin the process of civil asset recovery." Judge Collins closed the heavy black cover of the forensic accounting report. The sharp sound of the thick cardboard striking the mahogany bench echoed through the massive courtroom like a coffin slamming shut. The silence that followed was no longer just a mere absence of noise. It was a terrifying, suffocating physical pressure that pressed down entirely on Diane. She sat rigidly in her wooden chair, her face completely drained of color, realizing that the ultimate authority figure in the room had just seen through her entire fabricated existence. Judge Collins did not look at my attorney. She did not look at me. She focused her sharp, unforgiving eyes entirely on Diane and her deeply panicking lawyer, Warren Trent. "Counselor." Trent, Judge Collins began, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that forced everyone in the gallery to lean forward in their seats. "You came into my courtroom today and filed an emergency motion under the strict penalty of perjury. You demanded extraordinary financial relief for your client by painting a horrific picture of abuse, financial control, and malicious abandonment. You looked me directly in the eye and claimed this woman was entirely destitute and living in absolute terror." Warren Trent opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a frantic excuse or to blindly shift the blame entirely onto his client. Judge Collins raised a single authoritative hand and silenced him instantly. "Do not interrupt me," she commanded with absolute terrifying authority. "I have just reviewed irrefutable documentary evidence, including certified banking logs and time-stamped security footage. This evidence explicitly proves that your client is not a helpless victim of abuse. She is a highly calculated, remorseless financial predator who actively orchestrated a massive fraudulent loan against a property she does not even own. She then used those stolen funds to purchase secret luxury real estate for her adult daughter." Diane began to shake violently. The cheap gray cardigan she wore to project a false image of poverty suddenly looked like a prison uniform. She looked around the cavernous courtroom, desperately searching for a sympathetic face, but she found absolutely nothing but cold, clinical disgust. The sheer, unadulterated audacity required to commit a massive financial crime and then run directly to a family court judge to demand even more money from the very victim you robbed is completely breathtaking, Judge Collins stated relentlessly. "This court will not be weaponized to facilitate your boundless greed. This court will not be used as a blunt instrument of extortion." Judge Collins picked up her pen. The scratching sound of the metal nib against the official court order form sounded like a death sentence. "I am hereby denying your motion for temporary spousal support." In its entirety, she declared loudly for the official record. "The petitioner will not receive a single penny of the requested $15,000 a month. I am entirely denying the request for exclusive occupation of the marital residence. Furthermore, I am granting the respondent an immediate comprehensive judicial freeze on the luxury condominium located in the downtown district, pending a full civil asset recovery hearing. You will not sell that property. You will not transfer that property. It is entirely locked down by the supreme authority of this court." The reality of her total defeat finally crushed Diane. She let out a pathetic, breathless whimper, slouching entirely forward in her chair. But the judge was not finished. The civil rulings were only the beginning of the true consequences. Finally, Judge Collins said, her voice turning completely rigid and unforgiving. The intentional submission of a sworn affidavit containing massive verifiable lies is a direct assault on the absolute integrity of the judicial system. It is aggravated perjury. I am officially ordering the court clerk to immediately forward the entire transcript of today's hearing, along with the complete forensic accounting report provided by the respondent, directly to the office of the district attorney. I am formally recommending that severe criminal charges be brought against Diane Dalton for felony perjury, bank fraud, and elder financial abuse. At the exact mention of the district attorney and impending felony charges, the final fragile alliance in the room shattered completely. Warren Trent was a greedy, sleazy attorney, but he was not a foolish man, willing to lose his lucrative legal license and face potential disbarment for a broke, deceptive client. He stood up so fast, his heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the polished concrete floor. His face was pale, and he was sweating profusely under the bright fluorescent lights. "Your Honor," Trent stammered frantically, entirely abandoning his arrogant theatrical courtroom persona, "I must respectfully and immediately request to withdraw as counsel of record for the petitioner. I was completely misled. I was not made aware of any forged documents, stolen funds, or hidden real estate prior to filing this motion. My client explicitly and maliciously lied to me during our legal consultations. I cannot, in good conscience or within the ethical boundaries of the state, continue to represent her in any capacity." Diane looked up at Trent in absolute, unadulterated horror. The man she had hired to systematically destroy my life was now publicly throwing her to the wolves to save his own skin. He was actively confirming her guilt on the official court record. "You cannot leave me here," Diane hissed at him, her voice cracking with pure, unrefined panic. "You promised you would win this case for me." Trent did not even look down at her. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the judge, desperately pleading for professional mercy. Judge Collins looked at him with profound contempt, but she nodded her head exactly once. "Your request to withdraw as counsel is immediately granted, Counselor Trent," she stated coldly. "You are officially dismissed from this case. I strongly suggest you severely reevaluate your client intake procedures before you find yourself standing in front of a state disciplinary committee." Warren Trent did not hesitate for a single second. He rapidly shoved his legal pads and his expensive pens into his leather briefcase. He snapped the brass locks shut, turned his back entirely on Diane, and practically sprinted down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy wooden double doors swung shut behind him, the sound echoing with terrifying finality. Diane was left sitting completely alone at the massive petitioner's table. The vast empty space around her perfectly mirrored her devastating new reality. She had absolutely no money, no legal representation, no home, and an impending criminal indictment hanging directly over her head. She slowly lowered her face until her forehead rested against the cold, unforgiving wood of the table. She was completely broken. The brutal war she had so aggressively started was entirely over. I had successfully burned her plastic kingdom to the absolute ground without ever raising my voice, simply by letting the undeniable truth execute the flawless destruction she had always deserved. Brittany woke up the morning after the disastrous court hearing entirely alone in the stained motel bed. Her mother was completely catatonic, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper, broken beyond repair by the judge's brutal ruling. Todd had permanently severed their engagement with a vicious phone call from the county jail, leaving Brittany utterly abandoned. However, she still clung desperately to one final fragile delusion of superiority. She truly believed she was a highly successful independent entrepreneur. 3 years ago, she had opened a high-end holistic wellness boutique called Aura in the most expensive commercial district in the city. She sold imported healing crystals, ridiculously overpriced organic essential oils, and artisan silk yoga mats to wealthy, bored housewives. She had convinced herself that her business was a massive, self-sustaining empire. She actively ignored the financial devastation I had inflicted upon her mother, believing that as long as she had her boutique, she could easily rebuild her glamorous life. She dressed in her finest remaining designer business suit and drove her leased luxury vehicle to the storefront, absolutely desperate to reclaim her shattered ego and assume her rightful place as a wealthy business owner. She parked her gleaming SUV on the pristine tree-lined street and walked briskly toward her shop. She fully expected to see the soft, welcoming glow of the massive Himalayan salt lamps in the meticulously arranged window displays. She expected her perfectly groomed employees to greet her with absolute deference and offer her a cup of imported herbal tea. Instead, she found a massive, dirty white moving truck parked illegally across the front entrance. The beautiful custom-etched glass doors of her boutique were completely obscured by several large men wearing thick canvas work gloves. As she stepped closer, the suffocating reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical blow. The elegant brass handles of the double doors were tightly wrapped in a thick, heavy-gauge steel chain. A massive commercial padlock secured the chain firmly in place. A bright neon orange legal notice was taped aggressively to the center of the glass, completely covering the elegant gold leaf logo of her supposedly thriving business. "What are you doing to my store?" Brittany screamed, completely abandoning her carefully cultivated aura of peaceful spiritual wellness. She ran up to the entrance and physically shoved one of the large workers away from the glass doors. "You cannot be here right now. This is my private property." The workers completely ignored her outburst and continued stacking her expensive inventory of Tibetan singing bowls and organic skincare products into large cardboard boxes right on the public sidewalk. A tall, sharply dressed man stepped out from the back of the moving truck holding a heavy metal clipboard. He was the commercial property manager for the entire luxury shopping district. He looked at Brittany with a mixture of profound annoyance and complete professional detachment. "Step away from the doors immediately, Miss Dalton," the manager instructed coldly. "You are currently trespassing on seized commercial property." Brittany stared at him in absolute disbelief. She pointed a trembling finger at the neon orange paper taped to the glass. "I have a legally binding commercial lease," she demanded loudly, trying to summon the arrogant authority her mother had always weaponized. "You have absolutely no right to touch my inventory. I am going to call the police and have all of you arrested for breaking and entering." The property manager did not reach for his phone to call for help. He simply flipped to the second page on his metal clipboard and held it up for her to read. "You do not have a lease," he corrected her flatly. "Your commercial lease was explicitly guaranteed by a corporate backing from Dalton Engineering. 2 days ago, we received formal legal notification from Mr. Richard Dalton. He officially severed his financial guarantee and immediately canceled the automated quarterly rent payments that have kept this vanity project afloat for the last 3 years." Brittany felt the breath leave her lungs. "I pay my own rent," she stammered, her voice suddenly incredibly small and devoid of any confidence. "My store is highly profitable." The manager let out a short, completely humorless laugh. "Your store has never generated a single dollar of actual profit," he told her with brutal honesty. "Your monthly operating costs were $20,000. Your sales barely covered the electricity bill. Mr. Dalton has been secretly wiring the massive deficit directly into our corporate holding account every single month just to keep you from facing an embarrassing public eviction. Without his silent financial subsidy, you instantly defaulted on the entire lease. The contract allows us to immediately seize and liquidate all physical inventory to cover the massive remaining balance. You do not own a successful business. You never did. You own a pile of worthless rocks and a mountain of commercial debt." The caller identification screen on my private office telephone illuminated with a number I had fully expected to see. It was Brittany. The reality of the heavy steel chains on her boutique doors had finally fractured her completely. She had exhausted all of her external options and was now circling back to the original source of her unearned wealth. I let the phone ring 4 times, allowing the heavy silence of my office to absorb the mechanical sound. I did not answer the call because I felt a lingering sense of paternal obligation. I answered it because a structural engineer must always observe the final collapse of a condemned building to ensure the demolition is absolute and complete. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear, remaining perfectly silent. A pathetic, ragged sob burst through the speaker before I could even draw a breath. She was crying with a frantic theatrical intensity, designed specifically to trigger a protective instinct. She sounded exactly like a terrified child lost in a dark forest, entirely abandoning the arrogant, sneering woman who had tried to physically tackle me for my briefcase just 3 days prior. "Rick, please do not hang up on me," she begged. Her voice trembled violently, completely raw and breathless. "You are the only person left in the world who can help me. I am sitting on the dirty sidewalk outside my store, and they have taken absolutely everything. I have nowhere to go. I have no money for food. Todd abandoned me at the jail, and my mother is completely out of her mind. Please, you have to listen to me." I leaned back in my leather chair and listened. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not confirm that I was even paying attention. My absolute silence forced her to escalate her performance. She immediately pivoted to the core strategy of her emotional manipulation. She executed a flawless, ruthless betrayal of her own mother in a desperate bid for self-preservation. "I did not know anything about the forged bank documents," Brittany cried out, her voice rising in pitched desperation. "I swear to you on my life, I had absolutely no idea what she was planning. You know how my mother is, Rick. You know how she controls everything and manipulates everyone around her. She brainwashed me. She told me the loan was entirely legal and that you had fully approved it before you went into the hospital. I was just a pawn in her sick, twisted games. She forced me to go to the bank with her. She forced me to accept that luxury condominium. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to make you proud of my business." It was a spectacular display of calculated fiction. She was actively attempting to rewrite history while standing in the ashes of the fire she had joyfully helped ignite. She wept loudly, dramatically, blowing her nose, waiting for me to step in and rescue her from the villainous clutches of her mother. When I remained silent, she pushed even harder, attempting to weaponize the 15 years I had spent providing for her. "You are the only real father figure I have ever known," she whimpered. The word father felt like a toxic barb coated in sugar. "You raised me. You protected me my entire adult life. I know I have been ungrateful, and I know I have made terrible mistakes, but I am begging you for one final chance. I am not asking for the massive house or the luxury cars. I just need a small bridge loan. I just need exactly $50,000 to satisfy the commercial landlord, remove the chains from my store, and rent a tiny safe apartment far away from my mother. I will work day and night to pay you back every single penny with interest. I will go to therapy. I will be the daughter you always deserved. Please, Rick. Please do not let me die out here on the street. I love you." The sheer audacity of her request was truly breathtaking. She had actively conspired to dump me in a substandard nursing home to steal my estate, and now she was asking for a $50,000 reward for her failure. She spoke the words, "I love you," not as a profound declaration of human connection, but as a transactional currency she hoped to exchange for immediate cash. I noted the specific intonations she used to simulate genuine remorse. She deliberately lowered the pitch of her voice to sound smaller, more fragile, completely erasing the sharp, demanding tone she used when she felt secure in her wealth. She repeatedly used my first name to manufacture a false sense of intimacy, a psychological tactic designed to break down my defensive boundaries. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of her physical surroundings, emphasizing the dirt on the sidewalk and the cold wind directly contrasting it with the warmth and safety I had always provided. She wanted me to feel a crushing, unbearable guilt for her current physical discomfort. She wanted me to believe that my refusal to fund her vanity project was an act of profound, unnatural cruelty. She was entirely blind to the fact that her current suffering was simply the natural, unavoidable consequence of her own malicious greed. I listened to the rhythmic, hyperventilating sounds of her manufactured panic. I analyzed the precise cadence of her lies. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the profound, icy clarity of a man who has finally recognized a parasite for exactly what it is. She paused her frantic sobbing, holding her breath, waiting desperately for the sound of my voice. She expected me to sigh heavily. She expected me to offer a gruff but ultimately forgiving compromise. She expected the infinite well of my previous generosity to miraculously produce one final life-saving drop. Brittany finally stopped talking to catch her breath. She waited in the heavy silence for my inevitable surrender. She fully expected me to crumble under the crushing weight of her manufactured sorrow. I did not sigh heavily. I did not offer a single word of paternal comfort. I simply reached forward and moved my computer mouse to wake up the large monitor on my desk. I clicked on a specific audio file I had saved directly to my desktop 2 days ago. I turned the volume on my external speakers all the way up to their maximum capacity. I brought the telephone receiver very close to the speaker mesh. "You left your expensive tablet synchronized to the primary home network," I told her calmly. My voice was completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "You have always been incredibly careless with technology when you assumed someone else was paying the data bill. That tablet automatically backed up every single voice memo and recorded conversation to my central private server. You claim you were an entirely innocent victim of your mother. You claim you knew absolutely nothing about the forged documents or the malicious plan to steal my assets. You just begged me for $50,000 while swearing on your very life that you love me. I want you to listen to something very carefully before you ever try to speak to me again." I pressed the spacebar on my keyboard. The crisp, high-definition audio filled my quiet office and traveled directly through the phone line into her ear. The recording was captured exactly 3 weeks ago. It was the exact same day I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to a cardiac monitor, genuinely wondering if my failing heart was going to simply stop beating. The first voice on the recording was Diane. She sounded incredibly bored and deeply annoyed by the terrible inconvenience of my medical emergency. She complained loudly that the hospital smelled like bleach and that my prolonged illness was completely ruining her planned luxury vacation schedule. Then the second voice spoke. It was not the voice of a brainwashed innocent victim desperately trying to defend her stepfather. It was Brittany. Her recorded voice was sharp, wildly arrogant, and dripping with malicious, cold-blooded calculation. Brittany on the recording told her mother not to worry about the vacation at all. She said my severe heart condition was actually a massive financial opportunity for them. She explicitly laid out the legal strategy to declare me mentally and physically incompetent. She told Diane they needed to move fast before I recovered enough to check my bank statements or contact my attorney. Brittany actively suggested using the forged power of attorney document. She was the one who engineered the entire scheme to extract the $200,000 and hide it in a secret real estate purchase. I listened to the steady, shallow breathing coming from the phone receiver, as Brittany was forced to hear her own absolute betrayal broadcast directly back to her. But the recording was not finished. It reached the most devastating and cruel part of their conversation. Diane asked what they should do with me if I actually survived the hospital stay, but required expensive long-term care. The recorded version of Brittany let out a cruel, deeply dismissive laugh. She told her mother to just put me in the absolute cheapest state-run nursing home they could possibly find in the county. She explicitly stated that they could not afford to waste the estate money on private medical care for a dying man. She said they needed to preserve the maximum amount of cash for their own future shopping trips and business ventures. She called me a completely useless financial burden who had outlived his purpose. I pressed the spacebar again to stop the playback. The sudden heavy silence in my office was deafening. I brought the telephone receiver back to my ear. I could hear the faint sound of the city traffic passing behind her on the dirty sidewalk, but Brittany did not say a single word. Her loud, manufactured tears had vanished completely. Her elaborate, desperate lie was entirely incinerated by the undeniable truth of her own recorded voice. There was absolutely no defense she could mount against her own words. She could not blame her mother for manipulating her. She could not claim ignorance of the financial crimes. She was the primary architect of my intended demise. She had plotted to throw me away like garbage the second she thought my body was failing. "You are not a victim," I told her, keeping my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of any emotion. "You are a highly calculated parasite who actively plotted to lock me in a substandard medical facility to steal the wealth I spent 40 grueling years building. You smiled in my face and called me your father while you were actively digging my grave behind my back." She let out a small, pathetic gasp. She tried to form a word, perhaps another desperate lie or a hollow apology, but her throat was completely closed. The sheer terror of being fully exposed paralyzed her vocal cords. She finally realized that the bridge was entirely burned and the ashes were scattered to the wind. "You are never going to see a single penny of my money ever again," I stated with absolute terrifying finality. "The commercial property manager is going to liquidate your entire worthless inventory to cover the massive debt you owe him. You are going to learn exactly how the real world operates when you cannot steal from an old man to fund your pathetic delusions of grandeur. You have no business, you have no home, and you have no family left to bleed dry. Do not ever call this number again." I did not wait for her to respond. I did not want to hear another breath from her lungs. I placed the telephone receiver firmly onto the cradle, severing the connection completely. The financial and emotional umbilical cord was not just cut, it was entirely destroyed. I sat back in my heavy leather chair and looked out the large window of my office. The massive city skyline stretched out before me, built on solid, indestructible foundations of steel and concrete. I had finally removed the weak, rotting elements from my own foundation. My life was completely secure, and she was left exactly where she belonged. The silence in my office was profound and deeply satisfying after I disconnected the call. I had successfully dismantled the final pillar of Brittany's manufactured reality. She had always relied on a safety net, woven entirely from my labor. Now she was in a permanent freefall. But the consequences of her greed were not finished cascading. The destruction of her boutique was merely the afternoon preview of her absolute ruin. The true and final stripping of her status arrived exactly at midnight. Todd, in his furious panic from the county jail cell, had officially called his credit card company. He maliciously reported the charges for the cheap roadside motel as entirely fraudulent, actively seeking to punish Brittany for his own sudden incarceration. The motel manager was a large, unsympathetic man who possessed absolutely zero tolerance for declined payments or domestic drama. At 11:30 at night, he marched down the exterior concrete walkway and pounded his heavy fist against the flimsy door of their room. Diane and Brittany were huddled inside, completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of their catastrophic failures. The manager did not politely ask for a new form of payment. He loudly informed them that the initial credit card authorization had been violently revoked by the primary cardholder. He demanded they vacate the premises within 10 minutes, or he would physically drag them out onto the highway and call the local sheriff for severe criminal trespassing. They had no money to argue. They had no powerful attorney left to threaten him with a frivolous lawsuit. Diane and Brittany hurriedly gathered the few wrinkled garments they had managed to throw into their bags when they fled my house 3 days ago. They walked out of the dingy motel room in total public disgrace, the heavy door slamming and locking securely behind them. Their only remaining sanctuary was Brittany's pristine imported luxury SUV parked under a flickering yellow street lamp in the desolate parking lot. It was a massive leather-lined fortress of German engineering, completely out of place against the backdrop of the decaying motel and the cracked asphalt. They climbed inside the freezing vehicle, locking the heavy doors, desperately planning to sleep in the reclining heated seats until the morning sun offered them a new delusion. They genuinely believed the vehicle was their absolute, undeniable property. They had completely forgotten the ruthless efficiency of modern corporate banking. When I executed my silent financial severance, I did not just cancel the payments for Diane's car. I also permanently canceled the massive secret monthly direct debit for Brittany's luxury lease. The banking institution that technically owned her vehicle did not send polite reminder letters for high-risk, high-value assets when the primary guarantor vanished. They utilized advanced global positioning systems installed directly into the vehicle's dashboard. At exactly midnight, a massive heavy-duty commercial tow truck rolled quietly into the motel parking lot, its diesel engine humming like an approaching predator. The flashing yellow lights of the tow truck pierced violently through the dark tinted windows of the SUV, waking Diane and Brittany from their fitful, uncomfortable sleep. A burly repossession agent wearing a high-visibility reflective vest stepped out of the truck. He did not knock on the window to politely announce his legal intentions. He immediately backed his massive hydraulic lift under the rear axle of the luxury vehicle. The entire SUV jolted violently into the air, the heavy steel tires leaving the pavement. Brittany scrambled to unlock the door, throwing it open and screaming into the bitter cold night air. She demanded that the man stop touching her car frantically, claiming there was a simple bank error and threatening to call the police. The repossession agent simply reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a thick, legally binding corporate seizure order. He told her she had exactly 2 minutes to remove her personal property from the cabin before he towed the asset to a highly secure, locked impound lot. He did not care about her manufactured tears or her arrogant, hollow demands. He was simply executing the mathematical reality of a severely unpaid debt. Diane and Brittany were physically forced to step out of the warm leather interior and onto the freezing oil-stained asphalt of the motel parking lot. They stood shivering in the dark, clutching their meager overnight bags, and watched the heavy tow truck pull their final glittering symbol of wealth out onto the open highway. The red taillights disappeared completely into the distance, leaving them standing in the freezing night, with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. The absolute stripping of their status was now mathematically and physically complete. Brittany stumbled away from her boarded-up boutique with her phone clutched in her freezing hand. The absolute destruction of her business and the horrifying audio recording I played for her had completely shattered her mind. She blindly hailed a city taxi using the last $20 bill she had in her designer purse. She directed the driver to the luxury downtown condominium her mother had illegally purchased with my stolen money. She truly believed that despite the catastrophic courtroom defeat earlier that day, the bureaucratic legal system would take months to actually seize the property. She thought she and Diane could lock the heavy mahogany door, drink expensive wine, and hide from the world until they formulated a new plan to steal their way back to the top. She could not have been more wrong. The justice system is incredibly slow when you are fighting a vague civil dispute, but it moves with terrifying lethal speed when a furious family court judge personally issues a criminal asset freeze. When the taxi pulled up to the pristine glass-fronted condominium building, Brittany saw 2 marked city sheriff vehicles parked illegally on the brick driveway. She rushed into the opulent marble lobby and found her mother Diane sobbing hysterically near the concierge desk. 3 uniformed deputies were standing perfectly still, blocking Diane from accessing the private elevators. A stern female officer held a thick stack of legal documents bearing the official blue seal of the county court. The officer looked at Brittany with absolute professional detachment. "Are you Brittany Dalton?" the officer asked loudly. Brittany nodded her head, her throat too dry to speak. The officer handed her a copy of the emergency injunction signed by Judge Collins. This property was purchased using stolen funds that are now the subject of an active criminal investigation, the officer stated clearly, ensuring the wealthy residents passing through the lobby could hear every single word. The court has placed an immediate hard freeze on the asset. We have already changed the electronic locks on the penthouse door. You are both officially evicted from these premises, effective immediately." Diane tried to argue desperately, trying to summon her old arrogant authority. "You cannot just throw us onto the street without a formal 30-day notice," Diane shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble walls. The officer did not flinch. "You do not have a lease and you are not a legal tenant," the officer corrected her firmly. "You are a criminal suspect squatting in a crime scene. We allowed your mother to pack exactly 2 small overnight bags. If you do not vacate this lobby in exactly 60 seconds, I will arrest both of you for criminal trespassing and obstruction of justice." The total humiliation was absolute. The wealthy neighbors they had desperately tried to impress were stopping to watch the spectacle, whispering and pointing at the disgraced women. Brittany grabbed one of the cheap canvas bags the police had tossed onto the floor. They walked out of the gleaming building in total silence, completely stripped of their false royalty. They climbed into Brittany's imported luxury SUV, the only valuable asset they mistakenly thought they still controlled. They drove in stunned silence to the absolute edge of the city limits, pulling into the cracked, weed-infested parking lot of a squalid roadside motel. It was a filthy, decaying building with flickering neon signs and stained curtains. They used the last remaining balance on Brittany's personal debit card to rent a single room that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach. They sat on the sagging mattress in the dark, surrounded by peeling wallpaper, completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of their failures. But the universe was not finished extracting its toll. They had entirely forgotten that the monthly lease payment for the luxury SUV was tied directly to the corporate account I had permanently severed. At exactly midnight, the harsh flashing yellow lights of a commercial tow truck pierced through the thin, dirty curtains of their motel window. Brittany scrambled to the door and threw it open. A massive hydraulic tow truck had already backed up to her pristine vehicle. A burly repossession agent was securing heavy steel chains around the rear axle. "What are you doing?" Brittany screamed, running out into the freezing night air, wearing only her thin silk blouse. "That is my car. You cannot take my car." The repossession agent did not even stop working. He pulled a folded corporate order from his heavy jacket and handed it to her. "The primary guarantor completely revoked the financial backing, and your account is severely delinquent," he stated flatly. "The bank owns this vehicle and they want it back right now." He did not care about her manufactured tears. He climbed into the cab of his truck and engaged the hydraulic lift. Diane walked out of the motel room just in time to watch the heavy SUV rise into the air. The tow truck pulled out of the cracked parking lot and drove away down the dark highway. The red taillights faded into the absolute blackness of the night. Diane and Brittany were left standing on the freezing, oil-stained asphalt. They had no business, no home, no money, and no transportation. The plastic empire they had built on my back was completely annihilated, leaving them to freeze in the exact gutter they had designed for me. The morning sun brought absolutely no warmth to the freezing, oil-stained asphalt of the motel parking lot. Diane and Brittany were trapped in a squalid room with peeling wallpaper, entirely stripped of their physical assets and their manufactured social status. They had no money, no home, and no vehicles. The heavy machinery of the legal and financial systems had completely crushed their arrogant rebellion. However, cornered parasites are always the most dangerous when they realize their host has permanently severed the connection. Having failed to manipulate the bank manager, the legal system, and my own sense of obligation, they turned to the final desperate weapon of the modern coward. They weaponized public opinion. They decided to launch a vicious, coordinated digital attack designed to destroy my professional and personal reputation within our affluent community. Sitting on the edge of the sagging motel mattress, Brittany used her expensive smartphone to record a highly edited, deeply malicious video. They did not broadcast the squalor of their actual surroundings. They positioned themselves tightly against a blank beige wall to maintain a deliberate sense of vague, helpless displacement. Diane completely abandoned her usual aura of aristocratic superiority. She purposefully ruined her makeup, smearing mascara under her eyes to simulate hours of endless crying. She wore the same cheap gray cardigan that had completely failed to sway the family court judge. Brittany sat beside her, resting her head on her mother's shoulder, projecting the image of a traumatized, innocent child rather than a 30-year-old woman who had actively plotted to commit elder abuse. I sat in the quiet comfort of my home office and watched the video the moment it was uploaded to the primary community social media groups. They posted it directly to the Neighborhood Watch Forum, the local country club digital notice board, and several prominent local charity pages where I had donated substantial funds over the last decade. The performance was nauseatingly calculated. Diane stared directly into the camera lens with wide, terrified eyes. She spoke in a trembling, breathless whisper, claiming that the man she had loved and faithfully served for 15 years had suddenly and violently lost his mind. She explicitly accused me of orchestrating a cruel, systematic campaign of financial and emotional abuse. She completely erased the forged bank documents, the stolen $200,000 loan, and the secret luxury condominium. Instead, she spun a horrific fairy tale of sudden abandonment. She claimed I had secretly drained all of their personal bank accounts in the middle of the night. She wept as she described being physically forced out of her home, without even a winter coat, entirely dependent on the charity of strangers to survive the freezing night. Brittany chimed in precisely on cue, letting out a ragged sob and begging the community to pray for her mother's safety. They went even further, actively attempting to preempt my inevitable defense. Diane warned the community that I was a deeply manipulative sociopath. She claimed I was actively manufacturing fake evidence and spreading malicious lies to cover up my sudden mental breakdown. She begged our mutual friends, our neighbors, and my corporate colleagues not to believe the terrible things I was supposedly saying about them. It was a masterful, preemptive strike designed entirely to poison the well before I even had a chance to drink from it. They titled the video with a desperate plea for help and hit the publish button, sending their fabricated tragedy directly into the news feeds of thousands of wealthy, influential people in our city. They truly believed that the sheer volume of their fake tears would instantly overwhelm any logical scrutiny. They thought public pressure would force me to quickly surrender and offer a massive financial settlement just to make the embarrassing digital scandal disappear. They wanted to humiliate me into absolute submission. I simply watched the view count on the video climb higher and higher, observing the precise moment they voluntarily sealed their own inescapable doom. The digital infection spread through our affluent community with the terrifying speed of a malicious virus. Wealthy neighborhoods are fundamentally built on idle gossip and the quiet, secret enjoyment of watching a prominent person experience a sudden, humiliating downfall. Within 2 hours of Diane clicking the publish button, the fabricated video had been shared hundreds of times across every relevant local network. I did not have to actively search for the public reaction. The reaction came directly into the quiet sanctuary of my private home. The red notification light on my landline answering machine began to blink furiously. My personal smartphone vibrated continuously against the hard surface of my mahogany desk. The social execution they had so desperately prayed for was officially underway. I poured myself a glass of cold water, sat down in my leather office chair, and systematically pressed the play button on the answering machine. I decided to listen to every single message. I wanted to hear exactly how quickly 15 years of pristine social standing could be completely erased by 3 minutes of manufactured tears. The first message was from William, the sitting president of the Oak Ridge Country Club. I had personally sponsored his admission to the executive board 5 years ago. His voice was thick with artificial superiority and deep judgment. Richard, we have all seen the horrific video Diane posted this morning, William stated coldly through the small speaker. I have to admit, I am completely appalled by your behavior. To throw your sick wife and stepdaughter out onto the street like garbage is utterly reprehensible. Until this deeply disturbing domestic matter is fully resolved, the board has officially voted to suspend your access to the clubhouse. Do not attempt to show your face at the charity gala this weekend. The machine beeped sharply, instantly transitioning to the next recorded condemnation. It was Martha, the lead organizer for the Children's Hospital charity, where I had donated over $500,000 during the last decade. Martha had happily drank my expensive imported wine at my dining room table just last month. Now her recorded voice dripped with absolute disgust. "I am completely sick to my stomach after watching what you did to your family," Martha declared loudly. "We simply cannot associate our charitable foundation with a man who commits such severe emotional and financial abuse. I am formally removing your name from the gold sponsor registry for the upcoming winter banquet. We expect you to keep your distance from our organization permanently." The messages continued in a relentless, punishing wave. Former dinner guests, casual golf partners, and supposedly loyal neighbors all rushed to leave their angry self-righteous condemnations. They called me a tyrant. They called me a cruel, heartless monster. They entirely believed the absurd narrative that a successful structural engineer had simply snapped and decided to terrorize his innocent family for absolutely no logical reason. They did not pause for a single second to ask for my side of the story. They did not demand any actual proof of Diane's ridiculous claims. The sight of a weeping woman in a cheap gray cardigan was all the evidence they required to completely convict me in the court of public opinion. I even experienced the immediate physical chill of social exile when I walked down my own driveway to retrieve the morning business newspaper. My next-door neighbor, a man I had shared friendly conversations with for 12 years, was standing outside watering his immaculate front lawn. The exact moment he saw me step out of my front door, he immediately dropped his heavy rubber hose, turned his back entirely, and walked quickly into his house. He slammed his heavy wooden front door shut, making sure I heard the loud click of the deadbolt. I was suddenly a toxic pariah in my own neighborhood. Diane and Brittany had successfully executed their digital ambush. They had effectively weaponized the blind empathy of the general public to turn my entire social circle aggressively against me. They were likely sitting in their filthy motel room right now, frantically refreshing the comment section of their video, deeply intoxicated by the outpouring of unearned sympathy and the public rage directed at me. They thought this intense, suffocating social pressure would finally break my spirit. They thought I would panic and beg for a public truce to salvage my destroyed reputation. They were entirely wrong. I did not feel humiliated by the angry voicemails. I felt deeply grateful. They had just provided me with a highly efficient filtration system, perfectly revealing the hypocrites and the fair-weather friends who had only loved me for my wealth. I calmly erased the voicemails, opened my secure laptop, and prepared to deploy the absolute truth. I did not log into the social media platforms to defend myself. I did not type frantic paragraphs in the comment sections begging people to listen to my side of the story. Arguing with a digital mob fueled by manufactured outrage is a complete waste of intellectual energy. A structural engineer knows that when a severe fire breaks out in a building, you do not try to blow out the flames with your own breath. You must deliberately deprive the fire of its oxygen. Diane and Brittany had built their entire public smear campaign on the fragile assumption that I would be too embarrassed to expose the deeply humiliating details of our family collapse. They thought I would hide in absolute silence out of sheer terror. Instead, I spent my morning sitting quietly at my computer, meticulously compiling the exact instruments of their public ruin. I opened the secure video editing software on my laptop. I did not add dramatic music or emotional visual filters to manipulate the audience. I simply arranged the raw, undeniable truth into a single timeline. The video began with the high-definition security footage captured by the discreet camera I had installed in my own home office years ago. I originally placed it there to monitor the cleaning staff, but it captured the ultimate betrayal instead. The footage showed Diane and Brittany standing over my mahogany desk while I was recovering in the cardiac ward. The sensitive microphone picked up their exact words in pristine clarity. The video showed Diane holding my stolen checkbook, while Brittany actively practiced forging my signature on a blank sheet of paper. They laughed together as they perfected the fake signature they would later use to secure the fraudulent $200,000 loan. It was completely indisputable visual evidence of a premeditated federal crime. Immediately following the visual footage, I seamlessly attached the audio file I had played for Brittany the previous afternoon. The screen went completely black, forcing the viewer to focus entirely on the horrifying sound of their voices. The recording played the exact moment they coldly discussed my failing heart as a massive financial opportunity. It played Brittany telling her mother to lock me away in the cheapest state-run nursing home available the second my health declined, so they could steal the estate money for their luxury shopping trips. It was 3 minutes of pure, unadulterated cruelty, caught perfectly on tape. I exported the completed project as a single unlisted video file. It could not be found through a random public internet search. It could only be viewed by the specific individuals who received the direct digital web link. I opened my private email client and began constructing a very specific distribution list. I did not send the video to the general public or post it on the community message boards. I targeted the exact people who had aggressively rushed to condemn me. I typed the email address of William, the country club president, who had suspended my membership over a voicemail. I added Martha, the charity organizer, who had proudly stripped my name from her foundation registry. I included the local neighbors who had left angry messages on my answering machine, and the corporate colleagues who had sent me deeply disappointed emails. I systematically compiled a mailing list of exactly 75 highly influential individuals within our affluent community. These were the exact people Diane desperately wanted to impress, and the specific individuals whose social approval she fundamentally needed to survive. I left the subject line of the electronic mail completely blank. I did not write a long emotional paragraph defending my personal character. I did not demand apologies for their incredible rush to judgment. I simply typed a single factual sentence in the body of the message. I wrote that I believed they deserved to see the entire factual context behind the recent social media post before they finalized their personal judgments regarding my family. I pasted the unlisted video link directly below that single sentence. I reviewed the distribution list one final time, ensuring every single hypocrite was securely locked into the blast radius of the truth. I moved the computer mouse cursor over the send button and clicked it exactly once. The digital file silently left my private server and instantly populated the inboxes of the most powerful people in our entire city. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and took a slow sip of my dark coffee. I pictured William sitting in his pristine country club office, opening the email on his expensive phone. I pictured Martha sitting in her charity headquarters, hearing the cold-blooded cruelty of the women she had just fiercely defended. I did not have to shout to be heard. I did not have to beg anyone to give my reputation back. I had just dropped a devastating truth bomb directly into the laps of my harshest critics, and now all I had to do was sit in the quiet comfort of my home and wait for the massive shockwave to return to the epicenter. It did not take days for the truth to dismantle their fabricated narrative. It took exactly 45 minutes. I sat in my quiet office and watched my digital inbox transform into a desperate parade of cowardice. The very same people who had rushed to condemn me based on a weeping theatrical performance were now frantically attempting to erase their own vicious voicemails. The red notification icon on my screen climbed rapidly. William, the country club president, who had proudly suspended my membership just hours earlier, sent a massive block of text. He blamed his hasty judgment on a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. He begged me to accept his deepest apologies and assured me that my platinum status was immediately reinstated with a profound personal apology from the entire executive board. I dragged his email directly into the digital trash bin without sending a single word in reply. Martha from the Children's Hospital Charity was next. Her message was drenched in absolute panic. She realized that by publicly siding with a woman who actively plotted elder abuse, she had jeopardized the pristine moral image of her entire foundation. She offered me the honorary chairman position for the Winter Gala, desperately hoping to buy my silence with a hollow title. She stated she was physically ill after hearing the audio recording of Brittany discussing the cheap nursing home. I permanently blocked her email address. I had no interest in rebuilding a social network constructed entirely out of fragile, opportunistic plastic. The absolute silence from my end terrified them far more than any angry response ever could. They knew they had fundamentally failed a critical test of loyalty, and they knew I held the ultimate power to ruin their professional reputations by simply forwarding their initial, hateful voicemails. Across the city, sitting in their squalid motel room, Diane and Brittany experienced the brutal, suffocating weight of absolute social exile. They were frantically refreshing their social media pages, waiting for the next wave of unearned sympathy. Instead, their screens suddenly filled with the raw, unedited footage I had distributed. Their wealthy friends did not reply with words of comfort. They replied by forwarding the exact video link back to them in absolute disgust. The community comment sections, which just an hour ago were filled with vicious attacks against me, completely reversed direction. The digital mob they had maliciously summoned immediately turned around and devoured them alive. They were universally condemned. They were called predators, thieves, and monsters by the exact high society circles they desperately needed to survive. Every single door in the affluent community was permanently bolted shut against them. The devastation was not merely limited to their shattered social status. The unlisted video link I had sent to the local community members inevitably found its way out of the private circle. The digital file was forwarded relentlessly until it landed directly on the desk of the senior precinct detective I had contacted the previous day. The detective had already reviewed the high-definition parking garage assault and the bank security footage. The addition of the raw audio recording, explicitly detailing their premeditated criminal conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, provided the absolute final piece of the prosecutorial puzzle. The evidence was completely overwhelming and undeniably public. The district attorney did not hesitate for a single second. The legal machinery locked into its final lethal gear. A municipal judge reviewed the compiled digital evidence and signed a massive stack of official documents. The police department formally issued a felony arrest warrant for Diane Dalton. There would be no polite phone call asking her to surrender quietly. There would be no opportunity for a wealthy lawyer to negotiate a comfortable plea deal in a private room. The authorities located the exact geographical coordinates of her smartphone, pinging the active cellular signal directly to the squalid roadside motel on the absolute edge of the city limits. The final adjustment was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a fleet of marked police cruisers rolling out of the precinct, armed with the undeniable truth, driving rapidly toward the miserable concrete cage Diane had built entirely with her own hands. The freezing night air outside the squalid roadside motel was suddenly torn apart by the piercing shriek of police sirens. Diane and Brittany were still standing on the oil-stained asphalt, shivering violently in the aftermath of the vehicle repossession. They had no time to retreat into their filthy rented room. 3 marked city police cruisers swung aggressively into the cracked parking lot. The vehicles boxed them in, completely cutting off any theoretical avenue of escape. The harsh, blinding strobes of red and blue emergency lights illuminated the peeling paint of the motel exterior and cast long, terrifying shadows across the pavement. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicles simultaneously. They moved with a rigid, calculated efficiency that signaled the absolute end of the line. The lead detective, a tall man with a face carved from stone, walked directly toward Diane. He did not ask for her identification. He already knew exactly who she was. "Diane Dalton, you are under arrest by order of the county district attorney," the detective announced. His voice cut through the cold air like a steel blade. He reached to his utility belt and unclasped a pair of heavy metal handcuffs. Diane took a clumsy step backward, her cheap gray cardigan slipping entirely off her shoulder. The absolute reality of her situation finally breached the thick walls of her lifelong delusion. She was not going to a courtroom to manipulate a judge. She was going to a concrete holding cell. "I am a wealthy woman," she stammered, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You cannot do this to me. I live in a 5-bedroom house in the Premier District. My husband is a senior engineering partner. You have made a terrible mistake." The detective did not engage with her frantic, fabricated reality. He grabbed her right wrist, twisted it firmly behind her back, and locked the cold steel cuff into place. "Your husband is the primary complainant in this criminal investigation," the detective informed her coldly. "You are being charged with severe felony wire fraud, criminal forgery, and premeditated elder financial abuse. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you begin exercising that right immediately." The sharp, metallic click of the second handcuff locking around her left wrist echoed across the empty parking lot. It was the definitive sound of a trap snapping entirely shut. The last remaining fragments of her arrogant facade shattered into microscopic pieces. Diane did not scream or fight. The crushing weight of impending federal prison time caused her knees to buckle exactly as they had in my pristine foyer just a few days ago. 2 officers had to physically grab her by the arms and drag her toward the back of the waiting police cruiser. Her expensive designer shoes scraped uselessly against the rough asphalt. She looked back at her daughter with wide, terrified eyes, begging for a rescue that simply did not exist. The officers pressed their hands heavily onto the top of her head and forced her downward into the dark, caged back seat of the patrol car. The heavy door slammed shut, with a sickening thud, locking her securely inside. She pressed her tear-stained face against the thick, reinforced glass window, staring out at the miserable wreckage of her life. She was a woman who had spent 15 years demanding absolute luxury and total subservience from everyone around her. She had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars to secure her plastic kingdom. Now she was entirely confined to a space barely large enough to breathe, heading toward a facility where her demands would be met with absolute silence. The absolute power she believed she wielded was exposed as a complete pathetic illusion. She was finally forced to face the harsh, unforgiving consequences of her own malicious greed. The flashing emergency lights reflected in her terrified eyes, permanently branding the memory of her ultimate failure into her mind. The legal machinery I had quietly activated was now fully executing its purpose, processing her not as a privileged socialite, but as a common criminal facing years of mandatory incarceration. Her reign of manipulation was officially and permanently terminated. Brittany was left standing entirely alone in the center of the cracked motel parking lot. She possessed absolutely nothing in the world except the thin silk blouse on her back and the cheap canvas overnight bag resting by her feet. Her business was seized and boarded up. Her fiancé was currently sitting in a county jail cell. Her luxury vehicle had just been towed away into the dark night. And now the mother who had meticulously taught her every single toxic, manipulative tactic she knew was locked in the back of a police cruiser. Brittany watched the heavy tires of the patrol car slowly roll forward. The red and blue emergency lights painted her pale, terrified face in alternating colors of absolute despair. As the reality of her total isolation finally set in, a visceral, unhinged scream tore its way out of her throat. It was not a calculated cry for sympathy. It was the raw, primal sound of a parasite realizing the host is gone and starvation is imminent. "You ruined everything," Brittany screamed at the departing police vehicle. She ran forward a few steps, her voice echoing violently against the decaying walls of the motel. "You told me this was a foolproof plan. You promised me we would be rich forever. You destroyed my entire life." She was projecting every ounce of her own guilt and failure onto the woman who had nurtured her endless greed. She completely ignored her own active participation in the conspiracy to steal my money and lock me in a substandard medical facility. In her fractured mind, she was still the tragic victim of circumstances beyond her control. But the police officers inside the cruiser completely ignored her frantic screams. They accelerated onto the dark highway, the sirens wailing loudly into the distance, leaving her entirely behind. Brittany fell to her knees on the freezing, oil-stained asphalt. The bitter wind bit through her thin clothing, making her shiver uncontrollably. The deafening silence of the empty parking lot pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight. She had spent her entire adult life arrogantly looking down on the working class, entirely convinced she was inherently superior, simply because she had access to my bank accounts. Now she was kneeling in the exact type of squalor she used to mock. She had absolutely no one left to call. She had no safety net to catch her fall. The bridge was completely burned, the ashes were scattered, and she was stranded on the wrong side of the river. Her total abandonment was the flawless mathematical result of her own malicious choices. She would have to find a minimum wage job, rent a tiny room, and survive entirely on her own non-existent merit. The illusion of her grand, wealthy destiny was completely dead, replaced by a bleak, unforgiving reality she was entirely unequipped to handle. She wrapped her arms tightly around her own shivering torso, weeping bitterly into the cold night air. There was no rescue coming. The absolute zero balance of her life was exactly what she had earned. While the sirens faded into the miserable darkness of the city limits, I was standing 300 miles away in absolute perfect peace. I stood on the sturdy wooden porch of a beautiful secluded lakefront cabin surrounded by towering pine trees. I had successfully sold the massive 5-bedroom house in the premier district, exactly 48 hours after I permanently locked them out of the accounts. I did not negotiate the price. I sold it to a prominent cash buyer for a substantial sum, rapidly liquidating the physical monument to my 15-year mistake. The sprawling mansion, with its imported marble floors and crystal chandeliers, had never truly felt like a home to me. It was simply an incredibly expensive storage facility for parasites and their endless mountain of designer garbage. This cabin, however, was a dream I had quietly delayed for a decade and a half. It was modest, incredibly well built, and designed entirely for comfort rather than arrogant display. The air up here was crisp, clean, and completely devoid of the toxic, chaotic energy that used to suffocate me. I leaned against the thick cedar railing and breathed in the profound silence of a life finally reclaimed. There were no frantic demands for luxury car payments. There were no arrogant complaints about the temperature of the swimming pool or the brand of the groceries. There was only the gentle sound of the lake water lapping steadily against the wooden dock and the distant soothing rustle of the wind moving through the forest canopy. For 15 years, I had functioned as a human shield, absorbing the massive financial and emotional impact of two women who fundamentally despised me. I had ignored my own failing health and sacrificed my own happiness to honor a promise to a dead man. But the moment they actively conspired to throw my life away for profit, that agonizing burden was permanently lifted from my shoulders. The heavy steel chains of my false obligation were broken. I had orchestrated a complete structural demolition of their corrupt empire without ever raising my voice or compromising my own deep integrity. I had simply stepped out of the way and allowed the overwhelming weight of their own greed to crush them completely. The legal system was currently processing their crimes, ensuring they would never be able to victimize another elderly target. My professional reputation remained entirely spotless, completely insulated by the undeniable recorded truth. The chaotic noise of their existence was permanently erased from my world, replaced by a deep, resonant tranquility. I looked at the solid timber beams supporting the cabin roof above my head. As a structural engineer, I know the profound value of building upon a flawless, uncontaminated foundation. I had successfully purged the rotting wood and the corrosive rust from my daily existence. I was finally entirely free to construct the final peaceful chapter of my life, exactly the way I wanted it, governed solely by my own rules and my own desires. I stepped away from the cedar railing and walked back inside the warm, brightly lit cabin. I walked over to the heavy oak dining table and picked up a small rectangular piece of plastic. It was the completely new bank card. It was the exact same piece of plastic that had initiated the entire cascade of destruction when Brittany found me standing in the foyer just a few short weeks ago. To them, it represented a sudden, terrifying loss of unearned power. To me, it represented absolute, undeniable sovereignty. It was the physical manifestation of the impenetrable boundary I had finally drawn around my life. I slid the card smoothly into my leather wallet and placed it into my pocket. I walked over to the small, elegant wooden bar cart sitting in the corner of the room. I picked up a heavy crystal tumbler and uncorked a bottle of 20-year-old single malt scotch. It was an incredibly expensive, rare vintage that Diane had previously forbidden me from buying because she claimed it cut into her monthly clothing allowance. I poured a generous measure of the dark amber liquid into the heavy glass, listening to the deeply satisfying sound it made. I walked back out onto the wooden porch just as the sun began to slowly dip below the distant tree line. The sky erupted in brilliant blazing colors of deep orange and vibrant purple, reflecting perfectly across the calm surface of the lake water. I raised the crystal glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The scotch was incredibly smooth, burning with a warm, comforting fire in my chest. I watched the fading light dance across the ripples in the water. The grand ledger of my life was finally and perfectly balanced. True, unbreakable peace was officially achieved. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that unearned wealth inevitably breeds catastrophic arrogance. When you constantly provide a luxurious safety net for parasites, they will never thank you for the protection. They will only resent you for the dependency. True power does not require screaming in a foyer or posting tearful videos on the internet. True power resides in absolute calculated silence and the flawless execution of undeniable facts. Never set yourself on fire simply to keep ungrateful people warm. When someone shows you they view your life merely as a financial resource, you must sever the connection completely and permanently without a single ounce of hesitation. If you have ever had to ruthlessly cut a toxic parasite out of your life, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own story of silent victory in the comments below.